Hello everybody and welcome to Gyrocopter Flying Club. In this film we're going to look at Magni Gyro's M24 Orion. This aircraft was the very first factory built two-seat side-by-side enclosed gyroplane that was built to B-car section T. The M24 came out in the UK in 2010 and this aircraft is a 2011 version, so it should be reasonably faithful to the original. It's a glass fibre body which is then bolted to a steel frame, which is unlike Autogyro Cavalon, which is a monocoque cockpit with mast and tailplane bolted to the monocoque. The aircraft sits on its tail because of its CFG, and that does mean that ground handling is a small faff because you have to keep lifting the aircraft off the tail in order to move it. And also it means that you have to be mindful of entry and exit from the cockpit as the aircraft rocks back off the tail and then drops 6 inches onto the nose wheel. If we were to look up at the rotors on M24, similar to M16 from Magni, are composite and are significantly heavier than the aluminium extruded rotors that you'll find on an Autogyro. Indeed, Autogyro's latest top version of their rotors have also tried to become heavier in an effort, in my opinion, to try and mimic some of the more stable flight dynamics of Magni M16 and M24. We'll talk a little bit more about the flight dynamics later on in the film, but that stability isn't all positive. As we come around to the rear of the aircraft, you can see the flexible drive up to the pre-rotator, which takes its drive off of the propeller. In this case it's a 3-blade airplast fixed pitch prop. You can't buy an adjustable prop for an M24 in the UK. You can also see that the tailplane, and it's quite a bit smaller than things like Autogyro MTO Sport or MTO3, and if you transition to this aircraft from one of those other models, you'll notice that you'll need a lot more pedal in things like vertical descents. You can also see that the keel is straight, and in some ways that's quite a positive because the cranked keel, which is defined in many Autogyro products, has led, in my opinion, to quite a lot of accidents as people have over-rotated in the landing phase. There's some very good access panels on M24 to the motor, which does allow the daily inspection and en route checks to be done very efficiently. That's the right hand cowl. As we come round to look at the left hand cowl, you'll see that the access panel is equally convenient to look at things like the turbo, spark plugs and engine mountings. And then as we look down ahead of that access panel, we've got another access panel to look at the fuel level, which is very clear and convenient. Coolers, water cooler, oil cooler. You'll notice this was a 914 powered aircraft as we looked inside the engine. And as we come around to the cockpit, one thing which is very notable is that in an automotive context would be the A-pillar. They're quite thin. They're significantly better vision in an M24 than in a Cavalon, where the A-pillars are actually quite chunky. And as you open the door, you can see that there's quite a bit of a shape to it, which does allow some very, very good vision downwards when you're sat inside the cockpit. Just before we get inside the aircraft, a further comment on the door. Unfortunately, one of the early UK aircraft was involved in a fatal accident. Charlie Golf Tango India, if you want to read about it for yourself. But essentially the door came open in flight, and the pilot, being reasonably new and inexperienced, rather than flying the aircraft, got distracted with that open door and crashed fatally. The AEIB report noted that the mechanism, which is a simple bayonet type, which locates a spigot into a chute bolt, they noticed that that wasn't obviously closed when you're sat in the pilot seat, and as a result they've modified the aircraft so that the pre-rotator indicator, the electronic gauge, will not illuminate unless the door is positively closed and the micro switch senses that the door is properly closed. Of course, one problem with those micro switches is that as aircraft have become older, they drift out of adjustment, and therefore often you'll close the door only to find that it is properly latched, it's just that it hasn't tripped the micro switch, and then you spend a while faffing around trying to get the pre-rotator tacho to illuminate. As we put the master on, over here you can see it's a Garmin GPS map, and we've got vertical speed indicator, altimeter, ASI, and then on top a traffic awareness system. Then we've got compass, fuel pressure, manifold pressure, we've got radio, transponder. Then we've got a bunch of alarms which go from turbo failure, sensor failure, generator, fuel warning, trim light which goes green, which lets you know when you're fully forward trim, because there are quite a big trim change, especially on takeoff. Then you've got fire warning, you've got that door alarm, and I'll just show you the door alarm. If I get the door properly closed, you'll see once that micro switch is tripped, you'll see now that the rotor tacho has come alive, and of course the idea being that unless you positively close the door, you don't illuminate the rotor tacho, and therefore you're unlikely to be able to get airborne without knowing where your rotor speed is. Then if we look further at the cockpit, we'll see that we've got circuit breakers, we've got fuel pumps, landing light strobe, master on the switch, mags on the key, and engine start on the button. Then we can have a look at parking brake. Over here, throttle for the pilot, wheel brake, and then moving back across to throttle for the instructor. If we look down in the footwell, you'll see how the rudders move, and they move in the normal sense relative to what you may see on an aeroplane, unlike the organ style arrangement on auto gyro product. And now if we move to the stick, you'll see that it's quite an odd movement, and that's because the sticks, pilot and instructor, they both operate off a central connection, which is just down here, a bit like a sort of Robinson helicopter, and it means that when you roll to the left, the P1 pilot seat stick disappears down into the seat, and then the other stick rises, and as you roll to the right, you know, it's kind of vice versa, and that does mean it's quite a bit of control force. There's a stick retainer which is mounted on the pre-rotator lever, which also has got reasonable stick force. Then we've got rotor brake and choke. So let's just come back to these stick forces. I mean, essentially, not only is it quite odd the fact that as you roll left and right you've got some vertical movement of the stick, but if you're doing steep turns at anything sort of like a normal cruise, it genuinely is a two-handed operation, and that's limiting for most people. There's also quite high forces required to pre-rotate. I mean, this lever, if you've got small hands, and certainly if you're a woman, and that's no disrespect to women, but you will find it hard work, and I'll be surprised if future iterations of this aircraft don't look at that and make a change, because, you know, look, I'm sure fanboys of these things will say it isn't a problem, but honestly it really is. Also, I forgot to mention this central Rotax FlyDat control. This is effectively the Hobbs without the decimal point, and you've got engine RPM, exhaust gas temperature, cylinder head temperature, oil pressure, oil temperature, and I've got to be honest, I'm not really a big fan of digital representations of engine instruments. I prefer a good old-fashioned sort of gauge that I can visually see where values are, rather than trying to read it and then interpret the value. But that kind of, maybe that's just me. If we look at the ASI, you'll notice it tops out at 100. That's quite a bit down on the 120 of Auto Gyro's Cavalon. And to be honest with you, Magni M24 is happiest around sort of 18, 90 miles an hour. Once you get up to about 100, things get a little bit harsh. The other thing to note about the aircraft is that it's a 500 kilo aircraft, which is again down on later Cavalon, which are 560 kilos. And without really labouring the point, that's pretty limiting in 2019 for most, full-size adults, in the sense that, okay, the empty weight of this thing is less than the equivalent Autogyro aircraft, but only by maybe 15 or 20 kilos. And of course, once you fill this thing up with fuel, if you're, for example, a 90 kilo adult, then you've either got a very thin girlfriend or a child, essentially, as a passenger. As I get out, you can see it sits back on the tail and the nose is in the air, and then under the seat, this is the passenger seat, you've got a little storage bin. You can pretty much take headsets, maps and so on. If I look underneath the pilot seat, you'll see that there isn't storage under there, and the rest of the storage is less storage in this than Cavalon. You've got a couple of bags up on the bulkhead, but that's really it. Then we've got fresh air vent up in the ceiling there, which gives you, actually that's quite good cooling air actually, and you definitely need, if you come from an open aircraft, you'll definitely need that when you transition into an enclosed aircraft. In the summer they get very hot. Now, the other thing that I'd like to mention with M24 is the fact that, along with the stick force, the other worst thing about this is there's no in-cockpit roll trim. If we just look up on the rotor mast, you'll see the trim system, and yes, you can rig the aircraft such that you get effectively control force acting at a certain point on the rotor, which will give you an appropriate effect. But when you think that it's a side-by-side layout, and you can either go from thin passenger to big passenger, full fuel, no fuel, there is quite a bit of lateral trim change as a result of that. And you'll find that once you've rigged the aircraft for your most used configuration, everything else frankly is a compromise, and that is a real bind, especially if, when you're flying the aircraft or when you're living with the aircraft, you're going from solo to dual often. Now, you may think that I'm not really a fan of M24, and that's actually not the case. Would you believe, one of the best things about M24 is that it possibly represents the best value gyroplane for sale in the UK at the moment. It is an incredibly stable touring platform, and if you're not tubby and you can live with the 500 kilo max all up weight, these things come in. I mean, this aircraft's about 200 hours old, and it's sort of mid to high 50,000 sterling. Obviously new, they're a fair bit more in the UK, especially because sterling is weak at the moment. They're about 90 currently, but they also do a VIP spec, because this aircraft, as you can see, is pretty sparse in the interior. I think the VIP gives you a nicer interior, gives you some heating, and sort of, I think, a mast fairing as well. But yeah, they're terrific value. They fly real nice, and they're super solid. Magni M24, fly safely.